Hi, welcome to the Midtown Vineyard Podcast. We're so glad you've joined us online. For daily encouragement, events, service times, and more, check out our website and social media. And now, this week's message.
Let the king of my heart be the fountain I drink from. Well, I didn't get shaky first service. I might get shaky this one. It's hard to not cry just hearing all your voices and singing about that God. But I'm going to hold it together. If you brought your Bibles, open up to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. If you didn't bring a Bible, you can raise your hand. Somebody will bring you a Bible. Jay is back there, ready, locked and loaded. So we will turn there together. We often say we put the addresses on the screen, but not the actual verses. We want you to open the book and see it for yourself so you know I'm not lying to you. And we learn how to use these books, which I think is also a life skill and a bit of a lost art. Last week, we saw the answer without a question, giving us the answer to every question. You may remember the answer without a question gave us the answer to every question. What I mean by that is a man named Nicodemus, you may remember, comes to Jesus and he's flattering him. And before he can even ask a question, Jesus goes, I'm going to give you the answer. And he gives him the answer and we longing for it. Jesus goes, I know that answer is whatever Nicodemus was of God. And that's the conversation that John records for us between Nicodemus and Jesus. Nicodemus was a man who represented the best that religion had to offer. He was a Pharisee, which, if you're unfamiliar, these were folks who memorized the Old Testament, like that biggest portion of your Bible, and then on top of it, they memorized the rules that went with the rules to help you keep the rules, and then they lived really devout lives. I mean, this man was the best of what religion had to offer, and he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the top 70 in the country, and Jesus called him the teacher of Israel. He had status. He was elite. He was older, wealthy, pious, educated, esteemed. And despite these accolades, despite these credentials, despite these adjectives, Jesus informs Nicodemus that what you're still hungry for, what you're still searching for, is union with God, the kingdom of God, to enjoy the unity you had back in the garden. And restoration isn't going to happen by earning or by striving, which is what Nicodemus is used to. Nicodemus is used to climbing a ladder. If there's 30 levels and he's at level 29, Jesus, tell me the next step. And Jesus goes, oh, you're going to be so disappointed. You got to start all over. Like, it's almost as if you're going to have to be born again, which is where we get that phrasing from. What we discover through Jesus' conversation with him is that the religious don't have a leg up on anybody, that the wealthy, the esteemed, the pious, the educated, the scriptures say all of us have sinned and have been locked out of that union with God. We're all locked out of God's kingdom, right? And what we need is to be reborn, and Jesus offers us that. And then, remember, Jesus is telling this lesson to Nicodemus right before the story we're going to look at this morning. And John is choosing what stories to tell you on purpose. We've been studying the book of John for the last several weeks, you guys may remember. And what we said about his gospel is he writes after the other guys have written theirs. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have all been written. John is exiled and alone on an island with decades and decades to look back on, and he's been familiarizing himself with those texts for those decades. He's read Matthew, he's read Mark, he's read Luke. They all tell the same stories. They've all borrowed off of each other. It's why we call them the synoptics, which is your big word for the day. Syn means same, optic means look. They look alike. John goes, I want to tell you the stories they didn't tell you. And he chooses specifically what stories to tell you. And he tells us in John 3 about a conversation Jesus has with a religious man a man who's the best of what religion has to offer. And then in John chapter 4, to contrast that, juxtaposed up against it, he tells another story of another hungry, seeking, lost person who's hungry and seeking and lost. They're an outcast too outside of God's kingdom. They are juxtaposed. This woman has kind of a bad background, a bad reputation. She's the opposite of Nicodemus, and she's on equal footing as Nicodemus because all have sinned. So she's no closer to God than Nicodemus. Nicodemus is no closer than her. That's the setup for the story this morning. So I've given you enough time to turn there. That's what all that was. Like I was just buying you time to get there. Matthew. I know, you're going to have to turn again. John chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph." So we learn here that Jesus' popularity is continuing to rise. That was the setup for the John 3 conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus has to find him at night because there's no one else around, and he's gaining a following. In John 4, it's continuing to rise. Only they following him, people being baptized, although John is quick to point out that Jesus didn't actually baptize anybody. It was his followers that were baptizing the people. Either way, the religious elite are watching this, and Jesus knows they're unhappy with it. They like power. They like control. They're troubled by what's going on. So there's an inevitable clash coming. And he also knows now's not the time for the clash. Oh, there's one coming. He knows in John 3, he knows in John 4, you're going to kill me. This is where this thing is headed, but we're not there yet. So in order to keep from that confrontation happening yet, Jesus moves his disciples away from Jerusalem and to Samaria. So although the road through Samaria was the shortest route from Jerusalem to Galilee, pious Jews avoided it. You may know this. Samaritans were dirty, evil people to the Jews. I mean, there's a famous story you may be familiar with where the religious elite do the wrong thing, and Jesus has the hero in the story be a Samaritan because that was the most shocking thing he could think to share with that first century audience. The most shocking thing was a Samaritan being good in their eyes. Samaria was a place you avoided at all costs. There was a deep distrust, a dislike there between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. We're describing racism. It's what this is. The Samaritans were a kind of a half-breed, and the Jewish people looked down on them. So without getting into it too much, they ostracized them because they considered it dirty to be near them. In fact, not only would a pious Jew never dream of going through Samaria, but a rabbi going through Samaria and bringing his disciples with him. Like, not only would this stain his reputation, but it would stain all their reputations as well. All 12 of these fellas that are traveling with Jesus. And this is important because it's the whole setup for this thing. And the city of Sychar, which is where this is occurring, is the capital of the Samaritans. So, just to make this clear, Jesus isn't just wandering up to the line of Samaritan territory and sticking his toe over it with the disciples and going, okay, good. Like, we did it. We're shocking. Like, we've done something a bit different. He's pursuing the belly of the beast. He's going all in with them. Risky behavior. Why would he do this? Verse 6, Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, circle, underline, highlight, sat down by the well. It was about noon. Circle, underline, highlight. I feel like you're going to be circling and highlighting and underlining all morning. All of this is very important, and we'll unpack it all. After a long day walking, though, what John wants you to know is Jesus is worn out. He's been careful to show you that Jesus is God. That's the whole first chapter of his gospel. The setup, the introduction before he starts in on the Jesus stories. He wants you to know Jesus is God, but he also wants you to know that he's not a Superman, right? He's limited by our human limitations, the same way we are. While John insists that it was God who became flesh in Jesus, he wants you to also know that what this divine God became was actual flesh. Like he's tired. He's thirsty. Verse 7, a Samaritan woman comes near to draw water. Underline, circle, highlight, Samaritan woman. And Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples, parenthetically, had gone into town to buy food. So this woman comes for water at an unusual hour, and she comes alone. Which, when John writes, he assumes that you kind of know a lot of these details. He assumes that as readers, we're in the first century. We're familiar with the Middle East customs that are going on. So just to kind of unpack some of that for you, this is shocking. For a woman to be coming to a well in the middle of the day. Women came to get water early in the day or at night, and they came in groups, not by themselves. For this woman to come at an unusual hour and come alone, it must mean that she's a social outcast. She's shunned by other women in the community, which to me, this makes her a fascinating character. She's likely of mature age. She has not had an altogether reputable past, to say it kindly. She's a bit frivolous, I think, ready to talk with a stranger, which we're going to see in a minute, which was also shocking and unusual. She's got a quick tongue, which I love, but it turns serious matters into jests in no time. And she possesses, hidden beneath masses of unclean vanities, a conscience and a yearning for something more than what she has. I love this character. It's a beautiful woman. John includes this note about the disciples having gone into town to buy food because he wants us to know that had they been there, they might have said, you ain't talking to the rabbi, right? They might have chased her off. There's a chance that as they went down the road, they crossed paths with the woman who would have had to have gotten off the road and covered her face. We're talking about somebody who is marginalized by ethnicity, by gender, and what we're going to find out in just a moment, by background. And Jesus speaks to her. By tradition, a rabbi would never speak with a woman in public, even his own daughters or his wife. Rabbis would often make them wait at home, or if they did come in public with them, they wouldn't speak to them. They wouldn't be seen speaking to them. There were a group of Pharisees and rabbis who were called the bruised and the bleeding. This is kind of fun, and ladies in the room, I don't mean to offend you. This is history, not Tommy. They were called the bruised and the bleed on their way because they often did. It was not uncommon for a rabbi to have followers who he would walk with. They did life together as he taught them. If they came in contact with a woman, there was groups of rabbis who would have their disciples, and they also would shut their eyes all together, put their heads down, and keep walking. They're called the bruised and the bleeding because they would often walk into things like walls, bushes, trees, rocks. They would emerge bloodied and bruised. Like they forbade being near women. So when the text says that Jesus said to her, don't gloss over that too quickly. Those 4 words, Jesus said to her, this is a big deal. She's marginalized ethnically, she's marginalized by gender, and what we're going to find out, she's marginalized by her reputation. That's why she's out at this well alone in the first place in the heat of the day. This is a shocking exchange. Like, it's almost difficult for me to communicate how shocking this is. The Samaritan woman said to him, verse 9, she's shocked too, by the way. She says, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. Like, not just a Samaritan, I'm a Samaritan woman. Because again, in that day, how can you ask me for a drink? And then John goes, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So immediately this woman is impressed by the friendliness of Jesus. You see, she's shocked by it. It was unusual for her to hear a kind greeting from a Jewish man. Generally speaking, again, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, and especially males and females, and a rabbi no less. This was well understood. She says it to him as if, you know that you shouldn't be talking to me right now. And again, she's alone, which says that she's the outcast of the outcast. Like, the Jews hated the Samaritans. Their most merciful wish for Samaritans was that they might have no part in the resurrection. When God came back and resurrected the world, that he just wouldn't resurrect them. It's like, that's charitable. For many reasons, this woman would have been despised by any religious leader in the day of Jesus. Again, she's a woman, she's a Samaritan, she's a woman of questionable reputation. But remember, in Nicodemus' interview with Jesus, we learn that the religious elite are not closer to God. Like, they haven't earned any, in the eyes of God, like, they're no closer to being in the kingdom than a woman of poor character. And we're about to see that. Verse 10, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." So he uses curiosity to intrigue her into a curious conversation. He makes her curious about the things of God. He says, if you knew the gift of God. He makes her curious about who Jesus is. He says, if you knew who it was that you were talking to right now. He made her curious about what he could give her. He makes her curious. He says he could give you living water, right? There's a principle connected to the words, if you knew, you would have asked. Which, just pausing for a second, isn't that true of all of us? When we go to the Lord in prayer, if we go to the Lord in prayer, when I read that, I'm like, boy, he could say that. If you knew who you were talking to, you would ask for so much more. Right? Sometimes we view prayer as a last resort. Like, man, when there's nothing else I can do, it's like, okay, guys, let's just pray about it. Right? Okay, we've exhausted all the other, let's just pray about it. And Jesus goes, if you knew who I was, you would talk to me about that first. Before anything, before you explored the things you're capable of, you would go, you know what? Before I do anything, I'm going to get on my knees and I'm going to talk to Jesus. It's as if he's saying to her, like to us today, if you knew who it was that you've got on the line, you would use that phone a lot more often. Jesus tells the woman if she would have asked, he would give her living water. In ancient times, they call spring water living water because it seems alive as it bubbles up, right? As opposed to well water, which is stagnant and filled with sediment. So at first glance, it might seem to this woman or to us reading that Jesus is saying, there's an active spring nearby. Like, if you knew, like, I know the way, I could get you there. Because he seems to be playing with this idea of living water that's baiting her into this conversation. He uses curiosity to bait her along, to draw her out of her shell. Do you see this? It says in verse 11, "Sir," the woman says, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water?" So the disciples had probably taken with them a leather pouch they would have traveled with. Travelers in this day and age would travel with leather pouches so that when they got to a village and they needed some water, and they wanted to draw it out of a well, they could just take off the pouch and bring it up with water. And John's going, we kind of took that with us. So she was very confused. She's like, what are you going to draw water with? And she goes on. She says, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" It's hard to tell if this is a sincere question. It could be. I think she's being a little sarcastic. Right? She's like, are you greater than Jacob? Like, who dug this well, who drank from it himself? I think she's a bit cynical and honest and playful and sharp. She's asking a question rhetorically in a witty back and forth with someone she also found playful and safe. And I think the safety that she feels with him is crucial as he begins to lean in further. See, it's like he's drawing her out of her shell. He's having this witty, curious conversation with her, teaching her, showing her that he is safe to talk to. He teases her out. It's beautiful. It's quite compelling. It's like a turtle trying to get her to come out of her shell. He's like, boy, if you would just try, he's risking a lot by even talking to her. And I think this makes her feel safe. And so Jesus says in verse 13, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I will give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Jesus knew that this woman and everyone in the village she represents had to come to this well every day in order to get water, to satisfy their natural thirst. Jesus used thirst, and the writers of the New Testament do also over and over as a picture of spiritual need and a longing that we all have. A desire to fill themselves with something, hunger, satisfaction, lodging. What Jesus already knows, what the reader is going to find out in just a moment, is that this particular lady has a longing that she has been trying to satisfy in relationships. She's been trying to satisfy it in men. And she's seen her connection to the men in her life as being the thing that gives her identity. Her identity rests on her connection to or association with other people. We're going to see that in just a minute. Who she is attached to who she's with. That's what gives her value and meaning. And before we judge her or look down on her, isn't this all of us? Not necessarily the who we're attached to part, but that deep need inside of us that we feel we can get met by plugging into something. The scriptures teach that at the beginning of time, we lived in union with God in the garden. We had peace with God, and sin rushed into the picture and broke that connection. And we've been trying to satisfy that urge, that need ever since. And we find all these lousy places to get that satisfaction met, right? She's doing it with men, with people, with relationship. In the words of Blaise Pascal, what else does this craving, this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. Isn't that a powerful quote? Pascal says that we have this infinite abyss inside of us that we're trying to satisfy in all these other things. This is what the world of psychology or therapy has come to call our attachments, what we attach to for our meaning, or maybe in the language of Enneagram, your core needs or desires or motivations, what Reformed theologians call idols, what Father Thomas Keating calls our emotional programs for happiness, those things you think you need in order to be happy. If they don't go by the name of Jesus, it's an idol. It's something that's going to let you down no matter what. She has been trying to satisfy, to fill this longing in her soul through her connection to other people. And it has left her alone at a well in the heat of the day. That's why she's outcast. And Jesus makes her an amazing offer. What he offers this woman and to anyone who drinks was something that would give lasting satisfaction. That's what he's saying here. Boy, if you knew who I was and you knew what I could give you, boy, you would drink the water that would satisfy that thirst, right? It's common, I think, for people to try and satisfy their God-created thirst through all these other things. And Jesus goes, the only thing that can quench it is union with God. And someone might object. I drank what Jesus offers and I'm thirsty again. The scripture would teach, drink again. Go back to him. Stay connected to Jesus. Stay connected. Guys, you can't slip your hand up at the end of a sermon to give that your life to Christ, to experience union with God, peace with God, and then never go to his word to drink again. You're 15. The woman says to him, "Sir," what any of us would say, "give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." Her response is logical, not spiritual. It's physical. She goes, "Give me this water so I can avoid having to labor out here every day. The heat of the sun, having to fetch buckets and all that." And this is where Jesus makes his pivot. If you're watching in the conversation, this is where he makes his pivot from physical to spiritual. This is where he gets a little bit personal. He's earned the right to ask some hard questions. Look at verse 16. He says to her, "Go call your husband and come back." Go call your husband and come back. Verse 17, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." Notice how he puts his finger on the wound that's been causing her so much pain. He says, "Go and call your husband." This isn't a strange request. In this day and age, as this conversation became longer, more extended, Jesus would be straining the boundaries of cultural propriety. The conversation would be more appropriate if her husband was here. But he also knows this is a trigger for her. And so he puts his finger on that wound. He's inching towards something he already knows, the hunger, that thirst for satisfaction that she's been trying to satisfy through her connection, through her attachment to people, namely men. The attention is no husband. And she says it too, "I have no husband," which is technically true, but Jesus knows supernaturally, there's much more to the story of her marital history. Jesus brings up, he lovingly confronts the embarrassing issue that has caused her so much pain in her life, that had led her to being at this well in the heat of the day alone in the first place. When Jesus said the man that she lived with was not her husband, he goes, "Hon, you're just repeating the pattern. You're doing it. You're trying to satisfy this ache, satisfy this urge. You keep doing it. You're stuck in a pattern here." I think sometimes we think that God arbitrarily gives us a list of rules called the Bible. And he's waiting up in heaven with a lightning bolt waiting to smite us, just pacing back and forth, waiting for you to sin so that he can throw that lightning bolt down. He made these rules so that you wouldn't break them. And I think as I've walked with Jesus, as I've gotten to know God as our Father more and more and more, what I see over and over and over again is not a God who's waiting to hurt you. It's not a God who gave you rules so that you wouldn't break them. It's a God who gave you principles so you wouldn't break yourself against them. He doesn't want to see you hurt. This woman is hurting. She's disconnected. She's marginalized, and she's a social outcast because she's been trying to fill this ache. He's not coming to her with judgment. He's going, "Hun, look what's got you out here. This lifestyle, this pattern, this repetition, this thing that you keep doing, it just keeps going around and around. And look where it's got you. You're at a well in the heat of the day by yourself. How's this working for you?" She must feel so safe with him for him to put his finger on what's causing her pain. He doesn't confront. He doesn't cast judgment. He lovingly puts his finger on it because she knows, I think, that he cares for her, that he loves it. She must feel so safe with him. He's risking so much by talking to her. He's risking his reputation. He's risking the other men's reputation. She's ethnically separated and ostracized, socially separated and ostracized. Now we learn morally separated and ostracized. And inside that relationship of safety and care and loved, he's just shown her by carrying on like this. He's like, "Boy, I'm with you," right? And then he lovingly gets to address her issue that's separate from her. You see that, right? It's like he goes, "Hey, we're together. Like, I love you. You got some issues over here that we got to deal with. It seems like it's hurting you." He doesn't he doesn't just clash into her. I think sometimes in our dealing with people, that's how we treat issues. Like we get upset about their issues or whatever, and we just kind of smash into each other. Look at the way Jesus, he goes, man, we're one. I love you. Right? I'm out. I came all this way just to find you. Why else would he take this route into a forbidden territory other than to find this lonely, destitute, hurting woman at a well so that he could tell her how awful she is? No. He's engaging with her. She finds him safe. And then he's like, in that safety, it's like, we got this other stuff we should talk about because I don't want to see you hurting anymore. He begins to unravel her and take away from her, or at least expose that false self that she's developed somewhere. Right? I don't know why she's lived this lifestyle. We're not given a background, but what I would chance to think is that there's some kind of something hurting in her background, somewhere back at the core of who she is that she's been trying to fix through whatever. And she's developed this false self, and Jesus is going, oh, there's a different you. If you could just see what I see. I think as we follow Jesus, isn't that what he does with us too? As we learn who he is, as we walk with him, the scriptures call it sanctification. As you're transformed more and more into his image, what Paul calls being transformed from one degree of glory to the next. You start looking more and more like Jesus. Well, how does that happen? It's because as you walk with him, he begins exposing to you those things that he never put there. Right? Those things that come from a sinful world that we live in, that we develop along the way. I've been working my way through a book called Invitation to a Journey by Robert Mulholland. He shares kind of this idea from ancient monastics, and you've heard me talk about this before, about 4 layers of sin that we have to deal with as we walk with Jesus, as we live out our faith, as we're sanctified, big church word. This is what the early church fathers called purgation, because it was kind of a purgatory in this lifetime. Before the split between Protestantism and Catholicism, purgatory was kind of understood as just being cleansing. And they understood sanctification as being a purgatory here, right? You're being purged of those things that he never put inside of you to begin with. One layer at a time, over and over for years, if not decades, in walking with Jesus as he starts to expose to you sins or sinful behavior or even core motivations that you aren't even aware of. The first layer is something called gross sins. Not gross as in yuck, but gross as in we kind of all agree probably shouldn't murder, probably shouldn't steal, right? These are the ones that are so obvious to kind of even in a post-Christian society, it's the one that we all kind of like go, these are sin, like everybody agrees those are sins. Those are the things as you become a follower of Jesus that you kind of immediately try to stop doing. If you don't, you should stay after, we'll talk. But primarily, most of us try to stop doing these things. But then as you continue to walk with Jesus, he starts exposing a deeper layer called deliberate sins. As you move more and more into his likeness, these can be understood as those things that are kind of socially or culturally acceptable, but you probably wouldn't do if you were hanging out with Jesus. Kind of gossip, or what you watch on Netflix, or the type of music that you listen to. Like it's sort of, Christian people will do these types of behaviors, but might feel weird about it if Jesus was with them. That's that second layer of sin that he begins moving you through. But the third layer, as you go more and more internal, these are called unconscious sins. Over time, as you follow Jesus, and as you're ready for it, he gently, graciously, in love, starts to reveal those ugly motivations that are becoming pieces of your personhood. Often you're not even aware of these things. Kind of what we think of as blind spots, internal, relational stuff more than behavioral. The other 2 areas, those first 2, those are largely behavioral. If I can stop doing these things. As you get to the third layer, the unconscious stuff is the patterns of thinking and feeling that you're not even aware of. It's just somehow ingrained in you. And then, as you move further and further with Jesus, he gets to that deepest level, the ancients say, which is called trust structures. Those kind of just by nature of being here, you do the right thing, but for all the wrong reasons. This is often thought of as people who are very successful in the business world, but at the core of it, what they're really trying to do is heal a father wound. Because it's so deep in there. It's stuff that we're not even aware of, ways we cope with sadness or how we get our happiness. This is tricky, and it's deep, and it's hard. And I wonder what this lady went through early in her life that caused her at that deepest level to think that her meaning, her value, her identity came from her connection to her relationships in her life. It's a motivation thing at the deepest level, but it expresses itself in behavior. And as she begins to come in contact with Jesus and feel that safety, it's as if he begins to unravel, to peel back those layers and expose to her what Thomas Merton would call the false self. This isn't who you are. It's not who I created you to be. You should lay that down. The scriptures teach when you come to Jesus, you have to be born all over again. It's a lot like this, moving from that false self to the real you. Merton borrowed that language from the Apostle Paul, who would call you a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. He just traded it with language like false and real. There's a different you. Jesus is trying to bring you to who he created you to be. Our friend here at this well, who knows what kind of world she was born into? What happened at that deepest core level that hurt her so and made her act this way and behave this way? But somewhere along the way, down to her core, she developed an understanding that her meaning, her value, her identity anchored around her connection to men in her life. And so she became a slave to that because it provided meaning. For Nicodemus, it was following the rules, striving, earning, all the stuff that he could do, being the best of the best, the teacher of Israel. In both cases, Jesus gently puts his finger on that thing. With this lady at the well, after she's become safe, after she feels seen, he gently says, go call your husband. Which we come to learn means a lot more than go call your husband. Jesus knows that the men in her life are a source of meaning, and because of that treachery in her background, it's become a source of embarrassment and shame. It's what has her by this well in the heat of the day, all alone. She's hiding. Verse 19, "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you're a prophet," which is the understatement of the year. I can see that you're a prophet. She hadn't told him any of these things, right? And then change the subject. Great strategy. I do the same thing. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Like, okay, well, hold on. Remember we were talking about that core thing going on inside of you? She's like, yeah. Theological question. Where are we supposed to worship? You guys say it's in Jerusalem. We say it's over here, right? And Jesus answers her. He says, "Woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do, for salvation is from the Jews. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." I love this. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. Her shock is expressed right, as she tries to change the subject because his knowledge of her life, his supernatural perspective into things that she has worked so hard to keep hidden, has obviously stunned her, evidenced by her response. And so she shifts from shock to trying to change this up. This is an evasion, right? Avoidance, a distraction from talking about her stuff, but still relevant enough for Jesus to address. The Samaritans believed there was a mountain you're supposed to go worship on over in their territory, and the Jews thought it was in theirs, and there's this whole conversation about this. But Jesus says, there's going to come a time where it's not going to matter where you worship from, because the Holy Spirit is going to reside inside of you. So it won't matter if you're at a mountain in the Middle East or in a former restaurant in Myrtle Beach. He was talking about you. You guys just did this. We were singing a moment ago, and it felt like the roof was going to come off the place. You are the fulfillment of the prophecy. This is one of the most astounding things that Jesus says in all of the Gospels, and he says it to a outcast. He saves it for her. The woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he's going to clear all this up, which is so funny. That Jesus declared, I, the one you are speaking to, am he. Though this woman is a sinner, Jesus revealed himself to her. Why? Because Jesus reveals himself to sinners. As we read in the Gospels, he's reluctant with other people. Other times when they say, aren't you the Messiah? He'll go, shh, don't tell anybody. But with her, he just he saves it for an outcast, one that he sought out. Like, isn't it as if he knows exactly who she is and where she'll be at this given time? It's as if he came through a forbidden territory, along an inconvenient path just to find her. What a moment. To say to her, I'm the Messiah. I came here just for you. I've been looking. You're safe. You're loved. You don't have to hide anymore. You got some stuff. We can deal with it. But I see you and I love you. Tim Keller once said, to be loved and not known is flattering but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and fully loved is a lot like being. And he goes, hon, I've been coming for you. You don't have to clear. Hey, you got some stuff? We'll deal with that. But I came here just for you. I'm the Messiah. I'm clearing it all up. And then the disciples walk up. Moment over. Just then his disciples return. They're surprised to find him talking with the woman, but no one said anything. John's like, we learned by now, Jesus, a little different. What do you want? They didn't say, why are you talking with her? Then leaving her water jar in the school, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? They came out of the town and made their way toward him. So Jesus so impressed this woman that she feels compelled to go back to her city, back to her village, back to the people she was hiding from. Like, she was hiding from these people, and now she's preaching to them about her past. Like, she's not hiding anymore. She's like, he knows everything I've done. He's seen it all. He confronted my sin. He did it lovingly, and he loves me anyway. In John's language, grace and truth. Remember chapter 1? We said early in the days of this study that John had decades and decades to develop language for what he had experienced when he experienced Jesus. And the best he could do in the Greek, the best he can do is he was full of grace and truth. And often when I think about that, often all of us who are logical, we go, it's like a glass of water, and 50% of it is grace, and 50% is truth, or 60-40, 70-30. I mean, whatever concoction, 5 parts grace to 1 part truth, or vice versa, right? What John is saying is 100% grace and 100% truth in some kind of mysterious way. And we see that here. He sees everything she's ever done and says, I love you. Yeah, you got some stuff. It's hurting you. Don't you want to lay it down? Don't you want to give it up? I don't want to see you hurting anymore. But man, that's not who you are. That's just your stuff. In fact, I'm about to take that stuff and wear it on the cross. Right? To save you. You are so loved. You are so safe. You are so secure. Let's leave that aside and see, and he says this to a Samaritan woman, right? He's gone out of his way to find. She's so moved by that, she can't help but go find those people who used to reject her, and she's like, y'all, I met someone. You've got to come. He told me everything I've ever done. And the invitation is effective. The people came when she told them who Jesus was and how he'd impacted her life with just a brief conversation. You see it in 39. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. That was her testimony. Verse 40. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed for 2 days, right? So this isn't a toe across the line. This is like, I'm moving in for a bit. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, no offense, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we've heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. Right? Her testimony is simply, he knows everything I ever did, and he loves me anyway. How long had she carried that guilt, that shame, the burden of her secrets? And he didn't make them worse by confronting them, and he didn't avoid them either. He lovingly exposes them. She unravels her and lifts them off of her. This is the journey. This is the healing that Jesus offers and that we get to invite others into. As we walk with Jesus, as if he reveals to us all the things we've ever done. And he removes them if we let him. And we begin to understand who we are, the us that he created us to be. There's some who argue this is focused upon ourselves and not focused upon God, but there's no self-knowledge without God knowledge. This woman can't begin to confront her darker issues without coming into contact with God, wearing skin, named Jesus. Right? Up until that moment, she would have just kept repeating the pattern and repeating the pattern and repeating the pattern. But she comes in contact with God, and as he begins and she gets to know him, he begins to unravel and expose that false self, that shadow side that's kept her hidden and has been motivating and steering her behaviors for years. Isn't it true that when we don't confront this stuff, it doesn't just hurt ourselves, it hurts the people around us? These behaviors that we repeat and repeat, years and years and ripples of pain. But one contact with Jesus, and he exposes it gently. And he's like, don't you want to get rid of that? You can. I love that the story starts with him moving towards a forbidden people group. The Jews didn't associate with Samaritans. And again, if you were in the first century audience reading the story about a rescuer, you would be thinking, he's rescuing the wrong people. And isn't that the point? Aren't we all the wrong people? Jesus moves towards a woman who thinks she's far from God. And she has to be born again just like Nicodemus. And what's crazy about this story is that her healing heals others. When she finds love in Jesus, when she finds safety and drops her guard and finds healing, then her healing leads to others finding their healing. And now the gospel is moving through a forbidden territory. God is telling even the Samaritans that he's for them. All because Jesus knew a hurting woman life led to this moment. He could find her, go out of his way to find her. Guys, what if the same is true of you? What if every minute of your life has led to you being here today? In John chapter 6, there's this great story where, and we're not there yet, it's 2 more chapters, but I'm so excited about it. Where there's like 15,000 people all around and they're hungry, and the disciples are like, boss, you should probably excuse the people to go eat because they're hungry, which was code for, we're really hungry, Jesus. And Jesus goes, oh, no, you should feed them. And they're like, because they got nothing. And then this little boy walks up with a lunchbox, and, Andrew was like, we got a couple fish. Like, will that help? And he just threw gas on the fire, which I love. He's like, you feed them. And John says this, one of my favorite verses, he did this because he already had in mind what he was going to do. Isn't that always the case? Doesn't he always have? What if your morning, I don't know what got you here. I don't know if somebody invited you. I don't know if you were running late and you pushed through. I don't know if you were headed for a different church and you're like, doggone it, this is closer. Like, I don't know any, it's happened. We've heard wacky stories, wackier than that. What if the whole point, what if he knew you'd be here at this well for this moment? What if the God of the universe is watching and coordinating and adjusting his plans just to meet you here? What if, I've told you this before, I'm going to say it again. In the scriptures, in the Greek, the word for save is the word sozo. It's the same word as the word heal. When you hear about somebody being saved, when you hear about somebody being healed of their blindness, it's the same word. What we need is healing, spiritual and otherwise. Spiritual, of course, but there's an inner healing that happens too as we walk with Jesus, I think. We have to open our hand, let him unravel us. The same as her. We have to stop hiding. That's what got us into this mess in the first place. Remember the garden? So as we close, I'd like to give you just a minute to process all of this. I'm going to pray in a moment, and we're going to give the room to the Holy Spirit and just ask that He search our hearts. Tell us all the things we've ever done. What motivates us? What do we need to lay down? Then we're going to close by doing what Jesus prophesied we'd get to do. He said one day we would worship in spirit and truth, the location being totally irrelevant because of the spirit that inhabits us. So after we've had a moment to contemplate, we're going to stand, and Ashton will lead us in a song, and she will pray over us, and we'll be on our way. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask you, would you close your eyes? Jesus, I don't know the tracks that got everyone here, but you do. And there might be many this morning for whom this is their well. This is the place you intended to meet them. And you already have in mind what you're going to do. And Jesus, the same way you approached this woman, it's the same way you approach us today. Not to judge, not to condemn. You said just a chapter before that your Father didn't send you into the world to condemn the world, but to save it, to sozo it, to heal it. And Jesus, we need your healing. Same as this woman. A God who would step into our mess wearing skin just to tell us that we're loved, that we're seen with our stuff, that you want to nail that stuff to the cross. You want to rescue us, redeem us. What a miracle. So friends, as we take this moment to just allow the Spirit to examine us, where we're at in this story, invite you to, you can pray from your seat. You can join with other people in prayer. You can quietly just contemplate. I was on a Zoom call with about 100 other pastors about a week ago. So many of these guys were sharing how this is how they also close their services. Story after story of pastors where churches would go out like a rock concert. And more people are being drawn to just quietly allowing space for the Spirit to search, to reveal, to unravel us. If in this space, as He reveals, if movement would help, we've got these candles up here. You're invited. You can come up here and light one as you pray. Jesus just told us the location where you pray from is irrelevant. So these candles aren't special. To lay something down, just allow a tangible way to move. These kneelers too, if you'd like to lay something down. We have a communion table to my left, if that's something you'd like to participate in as a response. a wall to my right at the back of the room where you can write people's names that you're praying for. Spirit, we give you this room. Would you search us?
Thank you again for joining us online. We hope you enjoyed the message. To connect with us, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. For more information on who we are, check out our website, midtownvineyardchurch.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a review or drop us a comment. Until next time, have a great day.